He was the most powerful duke in London, a man who believed love was a weakness and marriage was nothing more than a business transaction. Sullivan Murphy thought he had devised the perfect punishment for his unwanted bride, a public humiliation so severe it would banish her to the countryside forever, leaving him free to pursue his scandals. But he made a fatal calculation. He assumed the quiet merchant's daughter, trembling at the altar, was weak. He didn't know that Galena Larkin had secrets of her own secrets that would not only bring his ducal house to its knees, but leave him utterly, irrevocably breathless. This is not a fairy tale. This is a war of hearts. London, 1889. The fog clinging to the cobblestones of Mayfair was thick enough to choke a man, but the atmosphere inside the private study of Ashbourne Hall was far more suffocating. Sullivan Murphy, the 9th Duke of Ashbourne, stood by the fireplace, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. The firelight caught the sharp, aristocratic planes of his face, high cheekbones, a jaw that seemed carved from granite, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, which made his current predicament all the more intolerable. "You look like a man marching to the gallows, not the altar," Arthur Pendleton drawled from the leather armchair, unconcerned by his friend's brooding silence. "The gallows would be quicker," Sullivan muttered, tossing back the scotch, "and likely less expensive in the long run. Come now, Ashbourne. It is not as dire as all that. The girl Miss Larkin is, it comes with a dowry that could rebuild the East Wing 3 times over. Her father, Mr. Thomas Larkin, has made a fortune in textiles. New money, yes, but money all the same." Sullivan slammed the glass onto the mantelpiece with enough force to crack the stem. "It is blood money, Arthur. It is the price of my father's gambling debts. I am selling the Ashbourne title to a shopkeeper's daughter to keep the roof from collapsing on my tenants' heads. Do not ask me to feign joy." The marriage had been arranged 6 months ago, sealed with contracts thicker than a Bible. Sullivan had never met Galena Larkin. He had refused every invitation to tea, every dinner, every ball where she might be present. To him, she was not a person. She was a ledger entry, a necessary evil. In his mind, she was likely some gauche, shrill creature, desperate for a coronet pushed forward by a social-climbing father. He hated her for it. He hated her for being the solution to his problems, for stripping him of his autonomy. "I have a plan, you know," Sullivan said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Arthur straightened, sensing the shift in the air. "A plan? The wedding is in 2 days, Sullivan. You cannot back out." "The contract. I will not back out." Sullivan interrupted, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I will marry her. I will take her money. But I will not be husband to her. I intend to make it very clear from the moment she steps into this house that she is unwelcome." "Sullivan," Arthur warned, "I have arranged for Lady Cecily Moncrief to accompany us on the honeymoon," Sullivan declared, watching his friend's jaw drop. "You cannot be serious. Taking your mistress on your honeymoon, it will be a scandal of epic proportions. It will destroy the girl." "That is the point," Sullivan replied coldly. "I want her to run. I want her to be so humiliated, so thoroughly broken by the reality of this marriage, that she flees back to her father's house in Cheapside within the week. She can keep the title of Duchess, I don't care. But I will not have her in my life. I will break her spirit before the ink is dry on the certificate." It was a ruthless strategy born of pride and resentment. Sullivan Murphy was a man who had hardened his heart against the world years ago when his own mother abandoned him. He would not allow a stranger to infiltrate his life. He would humiliate Galena Larkin so completely that she would become invisible. But Sullivan had failed to ask one question. Who exactly was Galena Larkin? If he had bothered to ask, he might have learned that she was not the trembling flower he imagined. He might have learned that silence did not always equal submission. The wedding day dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum. St. George's, Hanover Square, was packed to the rafters. The ton had turned out in droves, eager to witness the mismatch of the season, the golden Duke of Ashbourne marrying the textile heiress. They whispered behind their fans, wagering on how long it would take for the Duke to return to his bachelor habits. Galena Larkin stood in the vestibule, her hands clasping a bouquet of white hyacinths, so tightly her knuckles were white. She was 22 years old, though her serious demeanor often made her appear older. She was not a classic beauty by society's standards. Her features were too sharp, her mouth too wide, her eyes a shade of brown that most dismissed as plain. "Chin up, Lena," her father Thomas whispered, though his own voice trembled. He was a good man, but he was awed by the aristocracy. He thought he was buying his daughter a fairy tale. He didn't know he was walking her into a lion's den. "I am fine, Papa," Galena said. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. She knew the rumors. She read the gossip rags. She knew Sullivan Murphy considered this marriage a tragedy. She knew about Lady Cecily. Galena was not naive. She was a pragmatist. She had agreed to this marriage, not for a title, but because it was the only way to secure her younger sister's future and protect her father's business from the vultures circling his failing health. She was a sacrifice, and she had made peace with that. The organ music swelled a thunderous, demanding sound. The doors opened. Galena began the long walk. At the altar, Sullivan stood with his back to her for as long as possible. When he finally turned, his expression was bored, bordering on disdainful. He looked at her not with curiosity, but with the annoyance one might direct at a stain on a favored coat. As she reached him, the air between them crackled. He was devastatingly handsome, more so than the portraits let on, but his eyes were glacial. "My lord," she murmured, bowing her head. He didn't bow back. He simply stepped forward to take her hand. His grip was firm, impersonal. "Let us get this over with," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. It was a slap in the face delivered in a holy place. A gasp caught in Galena's throat, but she swallowed it down. He wants a reaction, she realized. He wants me to cry. She stiffened her spine. Slowly she raised her eyes to meet his. For the first time, Sullivan Murphy truly looked at his bride. He expected to see tears, fear, or the simpering adoration he was used to. Instead, he saw a calm, impenetrable void. Her eyes were not pleading. They were assessing. She looked at him as if he were a business contract she was still deciding whether to sign. The ceremony proceeded in a blur of Latin and liturgy. When the moment came for the kiss, Sullivan leaned in, stopping inches from her lips. The congregation held its breath. It was a moment ripe for romance, for a show of unity. Sullivan smirked, a cruel, imperceptible tilt of his lips. He diverted his course and brushed a perfunctory dry kiss against her cheek. It was the kiss one gave a distant aunt. A ripple of shock went through the pews. It was a public slight, subtle, but undeniable. Galena did not flinch. She did not blush. When he pulled away, she simply adjusted her glove, her face a mask of serene indifference. "You missed," she said softly. Sullivan froze. He stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I beg your pardon. You missed my lips, Your Grace," she said, her voice cool and carrying no trace of emotion. "I assume your aim is better when you are hunting, or we shall starve this winter." For a split second, the Duke of Ashbourne was speechless. He had expected a whimper. He got a critique. He narrowed his eyes, his grip on her arm tightening as he led her down the aisle. "Do not think to lecture me, madam. You have your title. Be content with that." "I am content with the title, my lord," Galena replied, looking straight ahead at the open doors, ignoring the whispering crowd. "I am merely concerned about your competence." Sullivan felt a flush of heat creep up his neck, not from embarrassment, but from a sudden jarring spike of adrenaline. She was mocking him. This plain merchant's daughter was mocking him. The carriage ride to Ashbourne House was silent. Sullivan sat as far from her as the confines allowed, staring out the window. He needed to escalate. The slight at the altar hadn't broken her. It had only seemed to bore her. She thinks she is clever. Sullivan thought his anger simmering. Wait until tonight. Wait until the wedding breakfast. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of Ashbourne House. It was a lavish affair, paid for entirely by Galena's father. Champagne flowed like water. Sullivan spent the first hour ignoring his wife completely. He stood in a corner with Arthur and a group of raucous bachelors laughing loudly, his back turned to the room. Then the doors opened, and a hush fell over the crowd. Lady Cecily Moncrief entered. She was a vision in crimson silk, a colour entirely inappropriate for a wedding guest chosen specifically to draw the eye. She was lush, vibrant, and undeniably beautiful. Sullivan set his glass down. This was the moment. The coup de grace. He walked across the ballroom floor, bypassing Galena, who was standing with her father. He walked straight to Cecily, took her hand and kissed it lingeringly. "You are late," Sullivan said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I wanted to make an entrance, darling," Cecily purred, casting a triumphant, pitying glance toward Galena. Sullivan turned to the band. "A waltz," he commanded. By tradition, the first waltz belonged to the bride and groom. Everyone knew this. The room froze. The musicians hesitated, looking from the Duke to the Duchess. "Play," Sullivan barked. The music started. Sullivan swept Cecily onto the floor. They began to dance a swirl of black wool and crimson silk. It was a flagrant, brutal insult. A husband dancing the first waltz with his mistress, while his bride stood alone. The humiliation was palpable. Guests looked at the floor, unable to witness the cruelty. Thomas Larkin looked as if he might have a stroke, his face purpling with rage. All eyes turned to Galena. This was it. The moment she would surely run from the room in tears. The moment she would become the laughingstock of London. Galena watched them spin. She saw the way Cecily whispered in Sullivan's ear. She saw the smug satisfaction on Sullivan's face as he looked over Cecily's shoulder, locking eyes with his wife, daring her to challenge him. Galena took a slow sip of her champagne. She felt the eyes of 300 people burning into her skin. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she had learned long ago that tears were a currency men like Sullivan Murphy did not value. She handed her glass to a passing footman. Then she did the unthinkable. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked across the floor, not toward the door, but toward the orchestra. She signaled the conductor to stop. The music died with a discordant screech of violins. Sullivan and Cecily halted in the center of the room, stranded in silence. "My apologies," Galena said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clearly in the cavernous silence. She had a voice that commanded attention, rich alto and steady. She turned to Sullivan. "My lord, it appears you are confused." Sullivan released Cecily, stepping forward, his eyes blazing. "Confused? Yes," Galena said, a small, polite smile playing on her lips. "You seem to have mistaken the order of events, or perhaps—" She tilted her head, feigning concern. "You have forgotten whom you married. It is a common affliction among the elderly, though I thought you were still in your prime." A collective gasp went through the room. Someone in the back snorted with laughter before covering it with a cough. "You tread on dangerous ground, madame," Sullivan growled, stepping closer, looming over her. "And you tread on my dress," Galena said, glancing down where his boot was pressing on her lace hem. "Please move. You are ruining the line." She looked up at him, her brown eyes hard as flint. "If you wish to dance with your friend," she gestured vaguely at Cecily, "you may do so, after you have fulfilled your duty to me. I paid a very high price for this dance, Sullivan, and I am a merchant's daughter. I always collect what I am owed." She held out her hand. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down in front of the entire peerage. "Dance with me, or admit you are a coward who bullies women." Sullivan stared at her hand. He could refuse. He could storm out. But if he did, he would look like a petulant child. She had trapped him. With polite words and a spine of steel, she had maneuvered him into a corner. For the first time in his life, Sullivan Murphy felt a flicker of something other than contempt for a woman. It was a spark of shock. He took her hand. It was warm, unlike his own. "Play," Galena commanded the band, not waiting for him. As they began to move stiffly at first, Sullivan looked down at her. She was rigid in his arms, smelling of lavender and starch. "You will regret that," he whispered near her ear. "You have made an enemy of me tonight." Galena looked up, and for a second the mask slipped. He saw a flash of intense, searing pain in her eyes, quickly covered by that iron will. "I do not fear enemies, my lord," she whispered back. "I fear being bored. And you were becoming terribly predictable." Sullivan spun her around, his grip tightening. He had planned to humiliate her. Instead, she had just declared war. And as he looked at the set of her jaw, Sullivan Murphy realized with a jolt that the battle for Ashbourne Hall was going to be far bloodier than he had anticipated. The morning after the wedding, Ashbourne Hall buzzed with a nervous energy. Sullivan had retired to his private study late into the night, nursing a formidable brandy and a burgeoning headache. He could still hear Galena's cool, defiant voice in his ears. "I always collect what I am owed." The audacity of it, the sheer, unblinking challenge in her eyes. It had been years since anyone had dared to speak to him with such insolence. "So the lioness has claws," Arthur remarked, finding Sullivan at dawn, still in his evening clothes, staring blankly into the unlit fireplace. Sullivan grunted. "She has a tongue like a viper, more like, and the constitution of a battlefield general. You did, however, promise to humiliate her, not inspire awe in the populace," Arthur pointed out. "The whispers this morning are less of pity for the poor Duchess and more of admiration for her spirit, and a certain amount of amusement at your expense, I might add." Sullivan flung his empty glass into the cold grate with a clang. "The honeymoon begins today, and it will be a spectacle she will never forget, or rather one she will wish she could forget. The chosen destination was the Duke's sprawling country estate in Kent, a Gothic pile named Blackwood Manor. It was remote, damp, and rumoured to be haunted precisely the kind of place Sullivan thought would exacerbate Galina's discomfort. The final cruel twist was the arrangement of the travel. 3 carriages waited outside Ashbourne Hall. The first, a lavish, open-topped phaeton, was for Sullivan and Lady Cecily. The second, a smaller enclosed brougham, was for Galina and her personal maid, a timid girl named Betsy, whom Galina had brought from her father's household. The third carriage carried their luggage. Galina appeared on the grand staircase precisely on time, dressed in a sensible travelling gown of muted grey, her hair neatly pinned. She looked perfectly composed, though her eyes held a guarded watchfulness. She paused at the sight of the phaeton, the crimson-clad Cecily already perched beside Sullivan, a proprietary hand resting on his arm. "Good morning, Your Grace," Galina said, her voice betraying nothing. Sullivan offered a curt nod. "Duchess, I see you have made your arrangements for travel," Galina observed, gesturing towards the open phaeton with a slight arch of her eyebrow. "How delightful for you! Though I confess, Lady Cecily, I envy you your fortitude. The morning air in an open carriage can be quite brisk. I trust you have adequately layered." Cecily, who had expected a tearful outburst or a stony silence, found herself momentarily flustered. I am quite comfortable, Duchess," she stammered, pulling her shawl tighter. "Splendid," Galina replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "One wouldn't want to catch a chill on such a momentous journey. Well then, Betsy, if you please. The brougham awaits." She turned, and without another glance at Sullivan or Cecily, elegantly stepped into the enclosed carriage. Betsy scurried in after her. The carriage door closed with a firm click, shutting her away from view. Sullivan watched the brougham's door close, a flicker of irritation, and then something akin to respect touching him. She hadn't broken, not even a crack. She was a fortress. The journey was long and tedious. Sullivan and Cecily endured the stares and whispers of villagers along the way, the public display a deliberate part of Sullivan's plan. He wanted the world to know he was rejecting his wife. Cecily preened, enjoying the scandal, while Sullivan found himself increasingly restless. He kept glancing back at the closed brougham, wondering what Galina was doing, what she was thinking. Was she weeping? Was she raging? Or was she, he suspected with a growing sense of unease, simply reading a book? By the time they reached Blackwood Manor, dusk had settled. The manor was a looming, shadowy silhouette against the bruised sky, its many chimneys like accusing fingers. "Welcome to Blackwood, Duchess," Sullivan said, as Galina stepped out of her carriage, looking remarkably unfatigued. "I trust the journey was comfortable." "As comfortable as one could expect, Your Grace," she replied, though I found the lack of conversation rather dull. One can only reread Pride and Prejudice so many times before one begins to develop an unnatural fondness for Mr. Collins. Cecily let out a sharp, forced laugh. Sullivan merely clenched his jaw. Inside the manor was even more unwelcoming. It was vast, cold, and echoing. Sullivan had given specific instructions. He led Cecily to the master suite, a lavish, sun-drenched room with a 4-poster bed and a dressing room. "And for my wife?" Galina inquired, her voice cutting through the silence. "Ah, yes," Sullivan said, turning to a footman. "Show the Duchess to the North Tower room." The North Tower room was notorious. It was the smallest, coldest, and furthest room from the main wing. It had a reputation for being drafty, with a single small window overlooking the overgrown gardens. It was the room typically reserved for disfavored distant relations or disgraced governesses. "The North Tower," Cecily gasped, a genuine shock in her voice. "But Sullivan, it is barely habitable." "Nonsense, my dear," Sullivan replied, his gaze fixed on Galena. "It has a bed, a roof, and an excellent view of the storm clouds gathering, perfect for quiet contemplation." Galena simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Grace. It sounds rustic. I dare say I shall find the solitude quite invigorating after the recent bustle of society." She walked past them, following the footman without a backward glance. Sullivan watched her ascend the winding staircase, his carefully constructed plan of humiliation beginning to fray at the edges. She was not reacting as he expected. She was not crying. She was not even protesting. She was simply accepting, and in her acceptance, there was a quiet, unnerving power. Later that evening, a meager supper was laid out in the small dining room for Galena and Betsy, while Sullivan and Cecily dined lavishly in the grand hall. Galena picked at her food, then set down her fork. "Betsy," she said, "fetch a lantern and my shawl. I believe a walk in the gardens is in order." Betsy, ever nervous, wrung her hands. "But Duchess, it's almost dark, and they say the gardens are quite wild." "Precisely," Galena replied, a strange glint in her eye. "Wildness can be quite liberating, Betsy. And perhaps," she added softly, "we can find a place where the air is not quite so stifled." She ventured out into the vast, untamed gardens of Blackwood, the lantern casting dancing shadows. The cold night air whipped her shawl around her. But Galena felt a strange sense of exhilaration. She was alone, truly alone for the first time in days. The silence was a balm after the constant cutting whispers. As she walked, she found a forgotten rose arbor, its thorny branches reaching like skeletal fingers. And there, tucked away beneath a gnarled oak, was a small, derelict cottage. Its windows were boarded, its roof collapsing, but Galena felt an inexplicable pull towards it. She pushed open the rickety door. Inside it was dark and dusty, but in the faint light of her lantern, she saw remnants of a life. A rusted thimble on a sill, a faded tapestry half hanging from a wall, a child's worn rocking horse tucked in a corner. It was a place of forgotten memories, of lives lived and then abandoned. A flicker of an idea ignited within her, a way to fight back, not with tears or anger, but with something far more potent. A silent, steady reclamation of her own space, her own worth. Sullivan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. Cecily's effusive chatter and constant demands for his attention grated on his nerves. He kept thinking of Galena in that cold, distant tower room. He imagined her shivering, weeping, perhaps even regretting her defiance. He wanted to feel triumphant. Instead, he felt empty. He excused himself early, claiming fatigue. He found himself walking towards the North Tower, a strange compulsion guiding his steps. He wanted to hear her cries, to see her broken. But when he reached her door, he heard nothing. Only silence. He pressed his ear to the wood, then, curiosity overcoming his disdain, he gently pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was untouched. Her few possessions were neatly arranged. She wasn't there. A cold dread seeped into Sullivan's bones. Had she run away? Had she fled back to London, fulfilling his desire? But on her own terms. The thought should have brought him relief. Instead, it brought a strange, unsettling panic. He searched the house, his anger mounting with each empty room. "Where is she?" he demanded of a sleepy footman. "The Duchess." "Your Grace," the footman stammered. "Betsy said she went for a walk in the gardens, sir, with a lantern." Sullivan cursed. The gardens at night. It was madness. He grabbed his coat a new unsettling fear twisting in his gut. She was stubborn, yes, but she was still his wife, and he had, by all accounts, driven her into the night. Sullivan plunged into the moonlit labyrinth of Blackwood's gardens, his breath misting in the cold air. The manicured lawns of Ashbourne Hall were a far cry from the wild, overgrown expanse surrounding Blackwood Manor. Trees clawed at the sky, their branches like skeletal arms, and ancient hedges loomed, forming impenetrable walls. He called her name, his voice echoing eerily. "Galena, Duchess." Silence was his only answer, save for the rustling of leaves and the hoot of an owl. His initial anger began to give way to a gnawing anxiety. What if she had truly fled? Or worse, what if she had met with an accident? The grounds were treacherous, riddled with hidden ponds and crumbling statues. He searched for nearly an hour, his irritation sharpening into a genuine concern he was loath to admit. He found the faint imprint of small footprints in a damp patch of earth near the rose arbor. They led toward the derelict cottage. "Of course," he muttered, a bitter laugh escaping him. "The one place I wouldn't think to look." He pushed open the creaking door of the cottage. The air inside was cool and cold, heavy with dust and the faint scent of damp earth. His eyes scanned the small single room. It was empty. The lantern she had carried lay on the ground, its glass intact, but its flame extinguished. Sullivan swore, raking a hand through his hair. Had she gone further? Deeper into the woods? He turned to leave his frustration a burning knot in his chest when a faint sound caught his ear. A rustle. Not outside, but inside the cottage. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the small pistol he carried for protection when traveling in the countryside. From behind a collapsed hearth, a figure slowly emerged. It was Galena. She was not crying. She was not disheveled. She was calmly dusting off her hands, a small smudge of dirt on her cheek. In her arms, she held the child's rocking horse he had noticed earlier, now strangely clean, almost gleaming in the faint moonlight, filtering through a crack in the boarded window. "Your Grace," she said, her voice entirely devoid of surprise, as if she had expected him. "Are you lost?" Sullivan lowered his hand from his pistol, a flush of heat creeping up his neck. "Lost, I was looking for you, madam. You left your room. You left the manor. It is late, and these grounds are not safe." Galena set the rocking horse carefully against a wall, admiring it. "Oh, I assure you, Your Grace, I am quite safe, and I am not lost. I was merely exploring. This cottage, you see, it has a peculiar charm, does it not? A hidden gem waiting to be rediscovered." Sullivan stared at her, utterly nonplussed. "Rediscovered? It's a ruin, Duchess. A hazard. You should be in your bed." "Perhaps," Galena conceded, turning to face him fully. Her eyes held an unusual sparkle in the dim light. "But then I would not have found this." She gestured around the small broken room. "This place has potential, Your Grace. Neglected, certainly. But imagine, with a bit of effort, what it could become." Sullivan scoffed. "It's a hovel, a memory of a forgotten servant. It holds no value." "Value is in the eye of the beholder, is it not?" Galena countered, her voice soft but firm. "Just as a duke might see only a means to pay his debts, others might see an opportunity to create something new from the wreckage of the old." Her words were a direct hit, a veiled but undeniable jew at his own predicament. Sullivan felt a sudden surge of anger. "Are you comparing this derelict shack to Ashbourne Hall, Duchess?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Not at all, Your Grace." Galena replied, her composure unwavering. "I am merely observing that even in the most neglected corners, there can be beauty if one is willing to look past the dust and the cobwebs. And perhaps," she added, her gaze unwavering, "even a new beginning." She picked up the lantern, relighting it with a strike of a match. The small flame illuminated her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw. "Now, if you will excuse me, Your Grace," she said, gathering her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "I have a few sketches to make before sleep. I intend to begin clearing this cottage in the morning. Perhaps with a little ingenuity, it could be transformed into a charming guest retreat. Or dare I say it, a peaceful sanctuary away from certain distractions." Sullivan watched her walk out of the cottage, her lantern swaying a small, defiant light, disappearing into the vast darkness of the garden. He was left standing alone in the musty, crumbling cottage, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. He had expected her to be broken by his cruelty. He had expected tears, pleas, or a bitter retreat. Instead, she was making plans. She was taking his intended punishment, the isolation, the neglect, and twisting it into an act of creation. The next morning, true to her word, Galena was up before dawn. She had enlisted Betsy armed with buckets, brushes, and a formidable will. They began the arduous task of clearing the small cottage. Sullivan, emerging from his bedroom after a restless night, looked out his window to see his Duchess sleeves rolled up her traveling gown, smudged with dirt, directing Betsy with quiet authority. Cecily, meanwhile, was furious. "She is making us look like fools, Sullivan," she hissed over breakfast. "She is acting as if she enjoys being banished, as if she prefers that hovel to the master suite." Sullivan merely grunted, pushing his eggs around his plate. He had no answer. He was unnerved. Galena was not playing by his rules. She was not responding to his provocations in the expected manner. She was not a shrinking violet. She was a strange, resilient weed, pushing through the cracks he had so carefully laid. That afternoon, Sullivan rode into the nearest village on a pretense of checking on estate matters. He returned late, expecting to find Galena subdued, perhaps finally broken by a day of manual labor. Instead, he found her in the main drawing room, impeccably dressed, overseeing the arrangement of a vase of freshly cut wildflowers she had gathered from the garden. "Ah, Your Grace, you have returned," she said, glancing up her hands, still arranging a particularly vibrant poppy. "I trust your ride was invigorating." "It was," Sullivan replied, eyeing the flowers with suspicion. "What is all this?" "A touch of life, my lord," Galena said simply. "This house is so grand, but it lacks warmth. I thought a few natural elements might soften its austerity." She turned back to the flowers, dismissing him. Sullivan felt a fresh wave of irritation. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to be the one dictating terms. But here she was, subtly, quietly asserting her presence in his home. That night, he found himself unable to sleep. The image of her covered in dust, but undeniably content in that derelict cottage, haunted him. He rose restless and walked to the window. The moon was high, casting the gardens in a silvery glow. He saw a light in the distance. The cottage. He dressed quickly and slipped out of the manor. When he reached the cottage, he found Galena inside. She had cleaned it remarkably. The floor was swept, the tiny window cleaned and unboarded, letting in the moonlight. She had lit a single candle, and by its flickering light she was sketching. She was drawing the rocking horse. She had found its worn features rendered with surprising tenderness. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm. "Can't sleep, Your Grace?" "No," Sullivan admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this small, unexpected sanctuary. "What are you doing?" "Drawing," she said, holding up the sketch. "It helps me to understand things, to see the details often overlooked." He walked closer, drawn by an unwilling curiosity. The drawing was good, surprisingly so. He saw the care in each line, the empathy in the portrayal of the abandoned toy. "Why this cottage?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Galina looked at the rocking horse, a faint, melancholic smile touching her lips. "Because it reminds me of myself, Your Grace. Discarded. Forgotten. But with a history, and perhaps a future, if one is brave enough to mend what is broken." Sullivan stared at her, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He had thought he was breaking her. He had thought he was humiliating her. But she was not broken. She was seeing him, dissecting him, and in the ruins of his cruelty, she was quietly, steadily rebuilding her own world. And in that moment, under the pale light of a single candle in a forgotten cottage, Sullivan Murphy felt a tremor he had not anticipated. It was not triumph. It was a strange, unsettling awareness that he had severely underestimated his bride. The battle had begun not with a bang, but with a quiet, persistent act of defiance. A week had passed since their arrival at Blackwood, and the power dynamic within the manor had shifted in a way that left Sullivan feeling like a stranger in his own halls. Galina had not only restored the cottage, she had begun to subtly influence the main house. She didn't demand changes, she simply enacted them. Fresh lavender appeared in the linens. The menus shifted from heavy, greasy meats to light, sophisticated French cuisine that Sullivan found himself actually enjoying. Lady Cecily, sensing the waning of her influence, decided to strike back. She convinced Sullivan to host a small, impromptu masquerade ball for the local gentry and a few friends travelling down from London. "It will be the perfect way to remind everyone, and her, where the true power lies," Cecily whispered, her fingers trailing along Sullivan's jaw. Sullivan agreed, though his heart wasn't in it. He found himself increasingly distracted by the sight of Galina in the gardens, or the way she looked under the candlelight during their silent, tense dinners. The night of the masquerade, the manor was transformed. Silk ribbons draped the stone pillars, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and beeswax candles. Sullivan wore a black velvet mask, looking every bit the brooding, dark lord he was reputed to be. Cecily was a vision in gold, a shimmering siren who never left his side. Galina was nowhere to be seen during the first hour. "Perhaps she has finally realized she doesn't belong," Cecily mocked, sipping her champagne. Just then, the music, a haunting minor key cello piece, shifted. At the top of the grand staircase, a figure appeared. The room went silent. Galina was not wearing the drab greys or browns Sullivan had come to expect. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to catch every flicker of light in the room. It was cut low enough to be daring, but high enough to remain regal. But it was her mask that stopped hearts. It wasn't a mask of lace or feathers. It was a delicate, hand-painted porcelain piece depicting a phoenix rising from ash. She descended the stairs with a grace that made every other woman in the room look like they were stumbling. She didn't look for Sullivan. She didn't seek out approval. She moved through the crowd like a queen visiting her subjects. Sullivan found his breath hitching. He had planned to ignore her to let Cecily shine while Galina wilted in the corner. But as he watched her, he realized he couldn't take his eyes off her. "Sullivan, you're staring," Cecily hissed, her voice sharp with jealousy. "I am merely observing the guest of honor," he replied, though his voice was thick. The night progressed into a blur of dancing and drinking. Sullivan found himself trapped in a conversation with Lord Montgomery, a local magistrate, when he saw Galena step out onto the terrace. Without a word to Cecily, he followed her. The night air was cool, the moon a silver crescent. Galena had removed her mask and was leaning against the stone balustrade, looking out at the dark woods. "You look different tonight," Sullivan said, stepping into the moonlight. She didn't turn around. "Different, my lord. Or just visible?" "Galena, you don't have to say it." "Sullivan," she interrupted, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were bright, perhaps with tears, perhaps with fire. "I know why we are here. I know about the wagers at your club. I know about Lady Cecily. You wanted to crush me. You wanted a wife who would be a ghost in your house." Sullivan took a step closer, his own mask forgotten. "I wanted to protect myself. I didn't want this marriage." "And you think I did?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I am a woman of business, Sullivan. I saw a man in debt and a house in ruin, and I thought I could build something. But I didn't realize the foundations were made of ice." She stepped closer to him, her scent lavender, and something sharper like ink filling his senses. "You tried to humiliate me, but all you've done is show everyone how little you value your own name. If you treat your Duchess like a servant, what does that make the Duke?" Before he could answer, she turned and walked away, her silk skirts hissing against the stone. Sullivan reached out, grabbing her wrist. The contact was like an electric shock. He pulled her back, not with anger, but with a desperate, sudden need. He kissed her. It wasn't the dry, perfunctory kiss of the wedding. It was a collision. It was filled with all the resentment, the unspoken challenges, and the sudden, terrifying attraction that had been building for weeks. For a moment, Galena fought him, her hands pushing against his chest. But then, with a soft moan, she yielded, her fingers tangling in his hair. In that kiss, Sullivan felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. He wasn't the one in control. He was the one breathless. The morning after the masquerade, the atmosphere at Blackwood was electric. Lady Cecily had left in a fit of rage, at dawn having witnessed the kiss on the terrace. Sullivan felt a strange sense of relief at her departure, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sense of guilt. He found Galena in the library. She was surrounded by the old estate ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Galena." He started, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Not now, Sullivan," she said, not looking up. "I've found something." He walked over, looking over her shoulder. "Those are the accounts from my father's time. They are a mess of bad debts and failed investments." "No," she said, pointing to a series of entries in a cramped, hurried hand. "Look at the dates. These aren't gambling debts. These are payments to a firm called L&M Holdings. Huge sums every month for 5 years. Sullivan frowned. "I've never heard of them." "That's because they don't exist," Galena said, her voice dropping. "I recognize the handwriting, Sullivan. It isn't your father's. It's Arthur Pendleton's." Sullivan felt the blood drain from his face. Arthur, his closest friend. The man who had managed the estate while Sullivan was in the army. "He wasn't just losing your money, Sullivan," Galena said, looking up at him with pity in her eyes. "He was stealing it. He orchestrated the debt that forced our marriage. He knew my father was looking for a title, and he knew you were desperate. He took a commission from both sides and pocketed the estate's remaining capital." The revelation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. The humiliation he had tried to heap on Galena was built on a lie manufactured by the man he trusted most. He had blamed her for his downfall when she was in fact the only person who had actually brought any honesty into his life. "He's coming here today," Sullivan whispered. "He's coming to check on the progress of our honeymoon. Then we shall give him a progress report. He won't forget." Galina said, her eyes hardening. The air in the grand drawing room of Blackwood Manor was thick with the scent of beeswax and the lingering chill of the morning fog. For the first time since their arrival, the room felt like a center of power rather than a drafty tomb. Sullivan sat in a high-backed wing chair, his fingers tracing the gilded edge of a tea saucer, though his gaze never left the door. Opposite him, Galina sat with a posture so straight it commanded the very shadows to retreat. They were waiting. The sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel outside signaled the arrival of the architect of their misery. Sullivan felt a surge of old familiar rage, but a glance at Galina stilled his blood. She was calm. She was prepared. She had spent the morning not in tears, but in the ledger her mind a steel trap of numbers and dates. When Arthur Pendleton was announced, he entered with the boisterous, unearned confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. He pulled off his driving gloves, tossing them carelessly onto a mahogany side table. "Ah, Ashbourne, Duchess." Arthur beamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He moved toward the sideboard as if he owned the house. "How is the rural life treating you, no duels yet? I hope I half expected to find the two of you in separate wings, or perhaps at each other's throats." Sullivan didn't rise. He didn't smile. He merely watched as Arthur poured a generous glass of sherry. "Actually, Arthur," Sullivan said, his voice as cold as a winter grave, "we were just discussing the accounts, specifically the L&M Holdings entries." The crystal decanter clinked sharply against the glass. Arthur's hand froze for a fraction of a second, a telltale sign that would have escaped Sullivan a month ago, but now stood out like a beacon. Arthur turned a forced, jovial mask plastered on his face. "Oh, those old business, surely. Your father had many unorthodox interests, Sullivan. I did my best to manage the wreckage he left behind." "It wasn't my father's wreckage, Arthur," Sullivan said, standing slowly. He felt a strange, grounding weight in the room, anchored by the woman sitting beside him. "It was yours?" Galina stood, then picking up the heavy leather-bound ledger from the low table. She walked toward Arthur with the measured pace of a judge. "I've spent my life in trade, Mr. Pendleton. My father taught me that numbers are the only language that cannot lie, provided you know how to read them. I recognize the handwriting in these marginal notes. It isn't the late Duke's. It is yours." Arthur's laugh was a thin, reedy sound. "My dear Duchess, I was the executor. Of course my hand is in the books." "To record legitimate transactions, perhaps," Galina countered, her brown eyes hardening like flint. "But L&M Holdings does not exist. I sent a wire to my father's solicitors in the city this morning. There is no such firm. There are, however, several accounts in the Caymans and Jersey under that name, accounts you've been funneling Ashbourne capital into for 5 years. You orchestrated the debt that forced this marriage, knowing my father was looking for a title and Sullivan was desperate. You took a commission from both sides and pocketed the rest." The color vanished from Arthur's face, leaving him looking sallow and diminished. The bravado collapsed, replaced by a desperate, feral twitch in his eye. He looked at Sullivan, searching for the old, easygoing friend he had manipulated for years. "Sullivan, listen, I can explain. It was for the good of the estate. I was protecting you from your own father's waste." "Get out," Sullivan growled. The sheer volume of his voice seemed to shake the crystals on the chandelier. He stepped into Arthur's personal space, his stature looming. "If I ever see you again, I will not call the police. I will handle it myself. You have 1 hour to clear your things from the guest house and vanish. If you are on my land by sunset, I will hunt you like the vermin you are." Arthur didn't wait. He fled the room, the sound of his frantic footsteps retreating down the hall, a pathetic coda to his betrayal. A heavy ringing silence fell over the drawing room. The tension that had held Sullivan's shoulders tight for years seemed to evaporate, leaving him feeling hollowed out and raw. He turned to Galina. She was still holding the ledger, her fingers trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. The woman he had intended to ruin had just saved his legacy. She had seen through the smoke and mirrors that had blinded him. "I don't know what to say," Sullivan admitted, his voice cracking. He crossed the rug, stopping a few feet from her. "I've been a fool. Worse than a fool. I was a monster to you, Galina. I took my shame out on the only person who was actually honest with me." Galina set the ledger down on a chair. She looked around the room at the wildflowers she had placed in the vases, the light she had insisted on letting in through the heavy drapes, and finally at the man who was looking at her as if she were a miracle. "You were a man trying to survive the only way you knew how," she said softly, her voice steadying. "But so was I. We were both pawns in a very ugly game." Sullivan reached out his hand, hesitant, before he finally touched her cheek. "Can you ever forgive me? I know I don't deserve it. I planned to make your life a misery." Galina leaned into his touch, a small, weary smile finally touching her lips. "I am a merchant's daughter, Sullivan. I don't give anything away for free. If you want my forgiveness, you'll have to earn it. And I suspect that will take a lifetime." Sullivan pulled her into his arms, not with the predatory fire of their earlier encounters, but with a deep, grounding tenderness. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and starch. "I think I can manage that," he whispered. He had planned to humiliate his bride. Instead, he had found a partner, a protector, and a love that left him for the first time in his life truly and utterly breathless. The war was over, and as they stood together in the fading light, the Duke of Ashbourne knew that the real story was only just beginning. The Duke of Ashbourne thought he could play with fire without getting burned, but in Galina Larkin, he found a flame that could either light his way or consume him entirely. In the end, the greatest scandal wasn't the wedding, but the way a man who hated love found himself surrendered to it. If you enjoyed this tale of high society drama betrayal and the ultimate victory of a woman with a plan, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button if you think Sullivan got exactly what he deserved, and share this video with someone who loves a good historical twist. Most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into the hidden scandals of the past. Thank you for listening, and remember, in the game of hearts, never underestimate the person standing across from you.